Hello, welcome to Western Wisconsin Journal. I'm Hudsonite editor and publisher Michael Foley, and with me for this segment are Hudson School District Superintendent Nick Owlett and Board of Education President Jamie Johnson. And this week we're going to be talking about the process to solve some of the space issues at the high school and the middle school we have here in the Hudson School District. And that process took a pretty big step forward last week when you took a multitude of options down, 22 options down to just 3. So let's talk a little bit, maybe just recap for folks who may not be familiar with the process about how we got to this point we are now.
I guess I'll start with that one because that process actually started before Dr. Nick came to the district in July. We started back in January and started really from scratch. So the first 3 stages, the first 2 really were dedicated to identifying, is there a problem? What are the issues? And I think what came out of that process pretty loud and clear is that we need to update and upgrade our facilities. In conjunction with that public input, we also did the enrollment projections and got those figures, and that has a big impact on, what it is that we're going to do to address those. So, it was a 7 or 8 month process that has culminated in a September 2nd workshop, which had, about 160 people in attendance. Right. And then now September 29th, I didn't count heads for our meeting the other night.
There was about 100 folks there, I think.
All right.
And you were collecting, as you said, community input all the way through this process, up to and including the September 29th meeting where there was a 70-minute public comment period before you guys went into deliberations. The board went into deliberations. What did we hear in some of that input?
Well, I'll let Dr. Nick handle that because he was moderated that portion of the meeting.
Yeah, I think we had people that spoke all over the gamut, from wanting the 9-12, wanting the 10-12, to maybe just kind of tinker around the edges to do something big and bold. I think the one common theme that came through in every speaker to a T, and I addressed this with both the middle school staff and the high school staff late last week, was every speaker said how impressed they were with the teaching staff and what we deliver for a product from the Hudson School District. And so, that was definitely a theme that came through. I've often told people we need to try to get the outside of the package to look like the inside. And so there really wasn't any one let's say, grade configuration or any one option that everybody pushed. So it was kind of all over the gamut. There were 17 speakers that spoke that night, and we didn't cut anybody off. I think our longest speaker spoke for 10 minutes, and our shortest one spoke for 1 minute.
Okay. And there were 22 options on the board for the school board to kind of sift through, and 10 of those options were brand new since the September 2nd workshop that was held. And a lot of those ideas came through from community members at that meeting, at that September 2nd workshop?
Right. Going into the September 2nd, the first 11 or 12 options, depending on how you used the numbering, because we had one option that was like a sub-A of itself. But that was really all from the community. It was just a matter of our architect taking what the community suggested for an option and then trying to put some bones on it and make it an option that would address various needs. Going into that September 2nd workshop, you're right, 11 or 12, we had another 8 that came out of the workshop itself, which was, a 2.5 hour time where people discussed different things and came up with variations maybe from the prior. There was one that was a completely new option, and that was kind of switching of the middle school and the high school campuses.
Sure.
So that was something new and creative that came out of the workshop. And then we held open the online comment for another 10-day period after the workshop, and then finally have to cut it off sometime, so September 15th. Now, there were still ideas being submitted even after that, but in the end, they all were basically variations of what came out of the workshop.
And the board had quite a task ahead of itself with these 22 options to try to whittle them down to, if you could believe it, just 3 options. And you guys used a process with stickers on poster boards, basically. How did that come about?
Well, the green dot, red dot exercise I've used with other boards when we've tried to prioritize things and build consensus. Anytime you're trying to get 22 options to 3 and you're trying to get 7 people to get consensus around it, it's a complicated process. What we wanted to do is we wanted to make sure it was as transparent as possible, and we also wanted to make sure that everybody's voice was equal and everybody's vote counted the same way. And so it was a great process. You know, on each of those green dots and red dots had each board member's name printed right on them, so you could see exactly how each board member voted or put their dots through each of the rounds. And it was just a very methodical process. Even sometimes when we thought we could rule out some early on, you could see how they came back around, and it really was a great process. In the end, we had a 7-0 vote on moving those 3 options to the survey. You know, that's not the 3 options necessarily. The board says, hey, this is the end all be all of these 3 options. It's just, these are the 3 options we want to get on the survey.
Right. So tell me about those 3 options. We have, so if you were if you're following along from the beginning, they were options 2A, 7, and 9. And going forward with the survey, they're going to be just options 1, 2, and 3.
Right.
So what can you tell folks about those 3 options that emerged from this exhaustive process?
Well, option 1 and 2 involve a new building. Option 1 is a new 10-12 at a location to be determined, which could be currently owned school land. So that's option 1, and it's essentially a very similar concept to what was put forward in the referendum in November of 2014. Option 2 is to build a new 8-9 and then remodel the 10-12 and keep it as a high school, but pulling the 9th graders out of there and then the 8th graders out of the middle school for a new building. Again, the priority is on land owned by the district. Right now that's designated to be County UU, but we had some board members that said let's explore what other possibilities there might be for a location there. But still, that's the second option. Option 3 is the remodel at both the middle school and the high school and accommodate some of those space issues, but also upgrading various needs we're lacking in common areas and core areas. That came through both on the Bray assessment, which Bray is our architect engineer that assessed the facilities, as well as just the community. I mean, folks that have lived here, you don't have to live here 25 years to know the certain things that our facilities are lacking. So.
Right. So as a board member, you got to deal with these, stickers on a poster board. How difficult was that for you to make these choices? It seemed like some of these board members had great difficulty eliminating some options that seemed like they could have been pretty viable. Well,
I personally, I can't speak for all the board members, but I saw the process started to get tougher about round 4.
Okay.
The first 3 rounds, I thought that some of these were so close that they were just variations off the others, and so that's why I kind of chose the variation that maybe was trying to be promoted there. I think the biggest divisions were whether or not we have 2 middle schools, whether or not we have an 8-9 building, like a second transition, and then, or whether or not we build an elementary school. And so it was interesting to hear the different board members on why they went in a certain direction. But I can speak personally that there were things that I put green dots on at the beginning of the night that I put red dots on at the end. And so I thought that was an interesting part of the process. Really credit Dr. Nick with coming up with that.
Well, and I think too, there's a variety of options. You guys didn't want to have 3 options that were essentially the same. So you didn't, nobody put all their stickers on things that were essentially the same variations on the same option. So I think that helps when you're putting together the survey. So about this survey, well, maybe we should go back and talk about the options a little bit more here. The price tags on some of these options, they seemed quite high. I know we just had a referendum that was rejected with a certain price tag, and some of these options are above that. I think all 3 of them might be above.
Well, actually, I want Dr. Nick to address that. I mean, he's worked most closely with the architects in working on these numbers. Of the 22, though, the 3 that were selected by the board were actually in the lower quartile of the cost.
Okay.
I think there was only one option that was the quote-unquote cheapest that wasn't selected. Otherwise, all 3 come from that lower quartile of cost. So definitely the board was cost conscious, but again, trying to look for what you get for your buck. And I know that there was a perception it was high. Some of that stuff has to do with the inflation. Sure. Of construction costs, what's gone on there. But
as these costs get refined from the architect and we start scoping the project, to more, exactly what it's going to be, are those costs going to come down, or are they going to go up? What's going to happen to some of those cost figures?
We would anticipate the cost to come down. You know, everybody always says, "Oh, what are you building? What type of finishes, or you know, what did you decide you wanted on these different items?" And I said, "Well, we haven't even gotten to that point because we put cost to 22 options, which is at a very, very high level." We just went with square footage costs with the architect. Our driver, or our number that we used, Prescott High School, that's being built right now, just went out to bid, I think, this last spring. And so what the architect did is they took what the actual bids came back. They inflated them for the rate of inflation in the construction industry over the next 3 years, 4 years, to account for the completion of our project to try to determine the cost. So when people say, well, are you talking about a Taj Mahal, or are you talking about a really high-end type of building or finishes? At this point, we're really talking about a building that's very comparable to what they're doing in Prescott, because we haven't even got into the conversation of what finishes and things along those lines are. Things you have to understand is when we talk about rate of inflation construction, it's not the CPI. I mean, it's not the 1 or 2%. It's really looking at, you know, it's its own separate animal. And so what our architect did is they surveyed 5 or 6 construction management firms to get an average of what they thought inflation was going to do in construction costs over the next 3 to 5 years, both in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, which we're on a suburb of, also western Wisconsin, and then the whole state of Wisconsin. And that's what we used for our kind of determining factor to determine square footage costs and rolling them forward. People have to understand that every year it's anywhere from 5 to 7% inflation. So when you start looking at a referendum, even the referendum that went out at $106 million total, the last one in November, you run that 4 years later, which is a very similar item, I think, to option number 1. It's going to cost $30 million more, possibly, because when you start inflating and compounding those costs. So, you know, those are some of the things that, whatever option we choose or whatever option people want to go with, it's going to continue to get more expensive the longer and longer we wait. We wish it wasn't, but right now the rate of inflation in construction is quite high.
Another issue I've heard in the community since the meeting was people have all kinds of questions about the music program, the athletic facilities, and whether that's something that should be part of this, or if it's not necessarily raising the costs of the project. What do you think about? I mean, is it viable to do something without upgrading athletic facilities and without music facilities?
Absolutely. So part of what we did in order to try to compare 22 options and not to have anybody think that we're trying to slant the cost one way or the other, is we made sure every option had the same upgrade. So if you were going to build a brand new facility with brand new athletic facilities, we made sure that the renovation of the current facilities and those options was to the equivalent status. And so there is a different line item in there in all of the options with the cost summaries. So you can say, well, for example, option 9, which is now option 3, was anywhere from $92 to $100 million. Anywhere from, I think, 10 to 11 million of that was athletic facilities. So you could easily say, okay, you know what, depending on what the public wants, we could break that out as a separate question. We could say we're not going to do anything with them for right now. You know, a variety of different options. That automatically could take $10 million off of the cost that we're looking at. Part of what's going to happen in the surveys, we're going to get that feedback from folks. Do they want it as part of this referendum question? Do they want it as a second question? Do they not want to address it right now at all? And so we're hoping to get that feedback here in the next couple of months.
Well, and let's talk about that survey. What can people expect to see in their mailboxes? It's not just going to be a quick little flyer that they usually get. It's going to be a pretty hefty piece of materials. What can people expect?
Well, with the survey, we're working with a company called School Perceptions, a great company to work with. They're going to see in a survey that's going to give a little bit of background on where we've been, some background on our finances, and some enrollment projections and demographic information. And then they're going to see descriptions of each of the options. They'll have the opportunity to answer some questions related to those, but then also answer questions related to cost tolerance, tax tolerance, things along those lines. You know, they may say that all 3 of these options are too expensive for me to support, but I could support a referendum at A. Or at B. And so what then that'll do is give the board the feedback from the survey to be able to say, okay, you know, if all 3 options got 33%, how do we start to pick between, you know, which option rises to the top? You start to look at some of those other residual questions that helps, you know, break down that data.
Okay. So how important is it for folks to take a look at the survey and return it? I mean, how are you guys going to be using this in your decision making at the board level?
Well, I think it's going to be definitely be important. So we want to encourage as much feedback as possible, and I'm not going to say that it's going to come down to which option gets the most feedback, because it's going to be not just the quantity but the quality of the responses. What we're trying to do, remember, is get something done that the community can live with for the next 25 years and beyond, 50 years maybe. And so that's going to require some folks to, compromise maybe where they're starting at. And that was one of my comments at the meeting, is that my thoughts on this subject have definitely changed over the last couple of years. But what we don't want is folks in the search of their perfect option. They'll reject everything else. That's what I was really liked about the comments from that public comment, that 70 minutes you mentioned that Dr. Ouellette moderated, was that you heard a kind of a common theme was, we need to get something done. We need to come together as a community and have some consensus. And so that's what this survey really is trying to do, is determine what's the consensus of the community. I just want to touch on one point, because you mentioned about the cost as being, these options being more expensive. Yeah, of the 22, I would agree that a majority of them were more than what was final on the ballot. I think Dr. Ouellette has addressed some of that construction and inflation costs. But if you broke it down, it really was $75 million for the new building, $25 million roughly for remodeling of the high school and repurposing it as a junior high, if you will. I use the junior high concept because to describe an 8-9. And then it was $4.5 million for athletic fields and another $6 million for another auditorium. So now the cost of that athletic fields is almost doubled. There's some reasons behind that, but again, we may be able to pare that down. Or, as you said, maybe it doesn't even make the main question and gets to be an auxiliary question. So we're still in the neighborhood of trying to do those facility upgrades that have been needed. And some people are critical of the process, that these are things that should be under our capital budget. Well, if we could have a time machine, and if that could be on the referendum, let's spend X number of dollars for a time machine, I think that would probably be the winning vote. Yeah. But barring getting a time machine to be able to go back and do things over, because similarly, if we would have gone back and if the 8-9 option had passed in 2003, we wouldn't be talking about this, because we would have had sufficient space. Sure. Now, we'd still be talking about, updating our 50-year-old boilers at the high school, but it would be a much smaller scale than what we're talking about now.
Aside from all the facilities, if there's going to be a new school built, you're talking about possibly some new staff costs and some maintenance costs and things like that. At some point, are those costs going to be factored into some of these options?
Definitely.
Yep. We just started putting that, not started putting that, but we think we have a range for each option that'll be on the survey associated with each option, what we think the ongoing operational costs will be for each of the options. And that takes into account a variety of things. They're very complex. Some people say, why didn't you have it for all 22? Well, because you're taking into account, how many more square feet are you heating and cooling? How many more square feet are you cleaning? What are you doing with your office personnel, whether it be secretaries, counselors, administrators, and things along those lines? Can you share? Can you split? Do you have to hire new? And so now that we've gotten into a more manageable situation with 3, we're able to kind of fine-tune those numbers a little bit more. And so the board will have those on the survey. When those hit your mailboxes, you'll be able to see exactly what those are.
And now this survey is going to be going out to every household, correct?
Yes.
What if husband and wife have differing views? Is there another way for the second person in the household to offer their input?
Yes, actually there will be a spot where if they need a second survey, they can just contact a phone number and then get it. It's all done online, so there's a survey number that way it prevents people from filling it out, multiple times.
Okay.
So.
Yeah, so essentially what will happen is, so every survey has a unique identifier that will get mailed to the house. People can choose 2 ways. It'll have, you'll be able to mail it right back to us if you want to do a written. Actually, it goes, I think, to school perceptions, and they can enter the data themselves if you're maybe not wanting to do it online. But if you are in a household where you want an extra survey, we will have extra surveys available at the district office, hard copies of those, and we can get those out to you. Otherwise, as Jamie said, we can call, and we'll have a list of these unique numbers that we can give out to people. So if their spouse wants to get online, anybody over the age of 18, and be able to give their input on a different survey, they'll be able to do that.
Sure. Looking back at a year ago, the community was pretty divided on this issue with the referendum, and it got to be pretty bitter. How has the community healed or come together with the transparency of this process over the last year?
Well, I guess that's one for me to answer.
Nick hasn't been around that long.
That's right. I think it definitely, that's what I've been really impressed with, is the people that came forward almost immediately after that referendum was done, and they said, hey, we want to be able to work towards a solution that we didn't favor this option, whether they were against the location, the overall price tag, or how it was structured with the questions on the referendum. It could have been a multitude of reasons, but I think we're trying to address that. And then the overall trust. I mean, they just put it out there that there's people who didn't necessarily trust the information, and I had individuals from the community saying, well, which one are we to trust? What the numbers you're putting out, or this other website has other numbers? In this case, starting from the ground up, every comment that every community member has made has basically been online, and those comments continued even after that public comment, that 70-minute section. Even during our deliberations, the 4 hours we took to narrow from 22 to 6, we were getting questions and comments. And ones that were questions that people wanted asked, we were asking them still right there up through the process that the board. So that's going to continue. We see the survey as an extension of that community involvement. So
great. Well, I think that's about all the questions I have. Is there anything I'm missing or anything that you folks would like to add?
Well, watch your mailbox. I guess that would be the key point, because while the board will be finalizing the survey at its October 13th meeting, and then it needs to get printed and mailed. So it could be as early as, I don't know, around October 22nd. I think our target date for ending it will be November 16th. So while, you don't have to answer in the first 2 or 3 days you get it. The key is holding on to that, because if you see it and it looks like just a general flyer or general information about the school district and it gets tossed, that's bad. You need to hang on to it when you get it, but better to fill it out right away and return it. But we're going to allow plenty of time for folks to have that.
So no real deadline.
Right.
I mean, at some point you got to make a decision. What's the deadline going to be for when you guys are not going to be taking those surveys into account?
Yeah. Well, I think Jamie alluded to it. It's around the 16th of November is when it closes.
Okay, so
there'll be a hard date on there. I'm just not 100. A lot of it's going to depend on what the board approves on the 13th of October. I think it's important also to mention that even if you don't have kids in the district, it's important to get feedback and provide those feedback, because the school district, although yes, it educates some of our youngest community members, it also is a viable part of the community and helps make the community viable in and of itself. So it's important to get feedback and what people want to support.
Not to mention we're all paying for it.
You're all paying for it. That's exactly right.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
And don't forget to check your mailboxes end of October.